My son slapped me and left. 5 years later, he showed up at my husband's funeral in a suit, holding papers, demanding half the ranch. That's my share. I'm his son. I just smiled. But when the lawyer walked in with the updated will, he slapped me and walked away. 5 years, not a word, not a call. But at my husband's funeral he showed up, polished shoes, black suit, holding papers demanding half the ranch. I froze, not from shock, but from pain. That moment I realized being a mother was the only thing I ever clung to. And it made me forget who I was. But somehow that very betrayal led me to a path I never saw coming. I'm Lorraine Brightmore, I'm 70 now, and I've lived most of my life on this land. 1,200 acres of walnut trees, rolling hills, and fog that settles soft over the fields in the morning like a memory. People drive past and call it peaceful, but peace I've learned is not always quiet. My husband Kenneth and I built this place from nothing. We were just 2 kids with a beat-up truck and a handful of seeds. While other couples went on vacations, we laid irrigation lines. While they watched movies, we watched the weather, praying the frost wouldn't kill our saplings. Over 4 decades, this place became more than a livelihood. It was our proof that 2 people with grit and patience could shape the land and leave something behind. We had 1 son, Jasper. He grew up with dirt under his fingernails and tree sap on his jeans. He used to run barefoot through the orchards, hollering like the world belonged to him. I thought he loved this land. I believed he would carry it forward when we couldn't anymore. But dreams change. Or maybe I just didn't see what was happening. In high school, Jasper stopped showing up for chores. He started calling the farm your thing, like it was something we forced on him. He got into college on a partial scholarship and left for the city like the earth was something to escape, not live with. Kenneth said to let him go. He'll come around. He just needs to find himself. For a while I believed that. I clung to the idea that one day he'd call and say he missed the smell of cracked walnut shells, or the way the porch creaked in the wind. But years passed, and all we got were silent birthdays and cold holidays. Still, I never stopped hoping. I kept a room ready. I stocked his favorite coffee in the pantry. I reread his last message more times than I'll admit. He hadn't even signed it with love. Just Jasper. Kenneth handled it differently. He got quieter, spent more time in the workshop. Some nights I'd hear him talking softly, not to me, not to anyone really. Just the silence. Maybe that's what aging does. It makes the unspoken things heavier. Then came the night that broke us. But I'll get to that. Right now, all you need to know is this. I believed with all my heart that my son would find his way back, that blood still mattered, that somewhere under all the distance the boy who once picked daisies for me was still there. I was wrong, and when I realized how wrong I'd been, it was already too late. If you've ever held on too long to someone who already let go, you might understand what I mean. If not, keep listening, you will. It happened on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of night when the wind picks up just enough to rattle the barn doors and make the walnut leaves scrape across the roof like whispers. Kenneth and I were in the kitchen finishing up dinner, nothing special, just stew and cornbread. I remember the way he looked at me across the table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He hadn't been sleeping well. Then we heard the truck, old engine, too fast up the gravel drive. I knew that sound. Even after 5 years I knew it. Jasper slammed the door before the headlights even dimmed. I opened the front door and there he was. Taller maybe? Leaner. Wearing a leather jacket he would have once laughed at. His eyes didn't look at me, they looked past me, right at Kenneth. I stepped aside and he walked in like he still lived there. Didn't take off his boots, didn't ask how he'd been. He tossed a manila folder onto the table, said he needed to talk business, said he had an offer. Kenneth picked up the folder and opened it. There were papers, appraisals, a proposed sale. Jasper had found an investor in New York, someone interested in buying part of the property for a retreat center. The price was decent. Jasper wanted to split the proceeds. Kenneth looked at me, then at Jasper. He didn't say a word. Jasper started pacing, said things weren't working out for him, said city life was harder than he thought. He had student debt, credit card bills. He needed this. And besides, we didn't need all that land anymore. It was too much for 2 old people to manage. I told him we weren't selling, that this land wasn't just land, It was everything. I said we'd help if we could, but this wasn't the way. That's when it happened. He raised his voice, accused me of always siding with Dad, said we were selfish, that we owed him something. His hands were shaking, his face was flushed. Then, without warning, he slapped me. The sound wasn't loud, not like in the movies. It was sharp and sudden. My cheek burned, my ears rang. Kenneth stood up so fast his chair toppled. He moved between us, not shouting, just standing there. He looked Jasper straight in the eyes and said, calm and steady, that he needed to leave. Jasper didn't argue. He just turned and walked out, got in his truck, sped off into the dark. Kenneth didn't say anything for a long time, just picked up the mug he'd been drinking from earlier, and stared into it like there was something left at the bottom he needed to understand. I sat down slowly, pressing a cold cloth to my cheek, though the sting had already started to fade. What lingered was heavier than pain. The next morning, Kenneth boxed up Jasper's things, didn't ask me to help, didn't explain. By nightfall the guest room was empty, his childhood photos taken down, the shelves bare. And just like that, our son became a memory we didn't know how to hold anymore. The morning of Kenneth's funeral was colder than expected. Late spring in Vermont still carried a bite if the clouds rolled in. I wore the dark navy coat Kenneth always liked, the one with the buttons he once sewed back on himself after I snagged it working in the greenhouse. It still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. The ceremony was simple. That's how he wanted it. We held it at the orchard, just behind the old shed he built with his father. A small group of neighbors came. A few former employees. A retired vet who used to buy lumber from us every fall. No flowers, just a pine casket. Closed. Kenneth wouldn't have wanted anyone looking at him lying still. I stood near the head of the grave, holding on to the folded letter he'd left me. My hands were steady. My voice didn't shake during the reading. I had rehearsed that moment so many times in my head for weeks leading up to it. The man I had spent most of my life with was gone. But I hadn't let myself cry. Not yet. We were nearly done when I heard the tires crunching the gravel. A sleek black car pulled up along the path near the barn. Too polished, too new, not local. The door opened and Jasper stepped out. 5 years older, clean shave, black wool coat, the kind of outfit you wear to make a statement. He didn't walk up to me. Didn't make eye contact. Just moved through the group like he belonged. A woman followed behind him. Younger. Blonde. High heels in dirt. And then a third man. Carrying a briefcase. The pastor paused. People looked around. No one said anything. Jasper waited until the last word was said, until the final prayer was spoken. Then he stepped forward, right up to the casket. He didn't place a hand on it. Didn't speak to his father. Instead, he turned to me and nodded once. Like we were two people in a meeting, not mother and son. The man with the briefcase stepped up beside him. Handed me a document. It was a legal notice. Jasper had filed a claim against the estate. He was requesting 50% of the property, the full back half of the orchard, and access to all operational equipment. According to him, he was the rightful heir. And since there was no public will, he had a legal right. I didn't react. I couldn't. Not right then. The woman with him, she smiled. Just enough for me to notice. Not wide. Just tight at the corners. As if this was something she had expected to go differently. And now it was going exactly her way. Jasper spoke quietly. Told me it was just business. That we could settle this quickly. That we didn't need to make it ugly. Then he turned around. And just like that, walked away. Left the papers in my hands. Left me standing by my husband's grave holding a legal threat from the son I had once swaddled in a flannel blanket in this very orchard. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say goodbye. The people who had stayed to support me now avoided my eyes. They trickled off, one by one. Their boots soft in the grass. I sat on the bench Kenneth built when we first cleared that back patch of land. Held the paper against my lap. Watched the last of the wind catch the hem of my coat. The part that broke me wasn't the lawsuit. It wasn't even his presence after all these years. It was how natural it looked on him. The coldness. The detachment. As if that boy barefoot in the walnut grove had never existed. As if I had only imagined being his mother at all. The morning after the funeral, I found myself standing in the middle of the orchard before the sun was fully up. The air smelled like damp soil and wood smoke. Kenneth used to say this was the best time of day when the trees whispered instead of shouted. I stood there for a long while waiting for the quiet to tell me what to do. The legal documents Jasper gave me sat on the kitchen table untouched. I hadn't even opened them again. But I knew what they meant. He was claiming half of the land, half of the equipment, half of everything Kenneth and I had built with our bare hands over 43 years. That evening I drove down to see our lawyer Bruce Langford. He was retired now, lived alone in a house with peeling paint and a yard full of wind chimes. He made me coffee without asking, and let me sit in silence for a while before I said anything. I handed him the envelope Jasper left me. Bruce read every page carefully, lips pressed into a hard line. Then he looked up at me and asked when Kenneth had last updated the will. I told him the truth. Kenneth had written a new one 2 years ago after his first surgery. It was tucked in the back of our fireproof box along with letters, insurance papers, and a few old photographs. Bruce exhaled slowly, said that was good. Said as long as it was signed, notarized, and clearly stated, Jasper didn't stand a chance. But he warned me. Even with a valid will, Jasper could still try to contest it. Especially if he claimed we manipulated Kenneth or concealed documents. I drove home just after dark, headlights cutting through the fog. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed silence. The kind of silence that lets your mind run wild. When I got back, I went straight to the office. I pulled out the fireproof box, opened it, and took out the will. My hands were steady. Kenneth's handwriting filled the pages neat and deliberate. He had left everything to me. Every acre, every tool, every debt, and every dollar. Jasper's name wasn't mentioned once. I remembered the day Kenneth wrote it. He had come in from the fields with his back aching and asked me to sit with him while he drafted it. He didn't want Jasper fighting over the land. He didn't trust what Jasper had become. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to write the words out loud. I was the one who typed them up. In that moment, I didn't feel relieved. I felt hollow. This wasn't how I imagined protecting the ranch. Not through paperwork. Not through courts and legal threats. I had always pictured Jasper walking beside me, not standing across from me with a lawyer at his side. I put the will back in the box and locked it. Then I opened the drawer beneath and pulled out something I hadn't touched in years. My journal. Inside were dozens of entries, letters to Kenneth, notes about the farm, and stories. Stories about Jasper, some proud, some painful. Some I had written the night he left. Others after long silences, and one entry in particular. The day he struck me, I had written every word, every emotion. The way the room looked, the way his eyes avoided mine. The sound of the door slamming. I had documented everything. That night, I made a copy of the will. I made a copy of that journal page too, and I sealed both in an envelope marked with Bruce's name. If Jasper was going to take this to court, then I would be ready, not just as a mother, but as the woman who built something worth protecting. And this time, I wasn't going to hope for him to come back. I was going to defend the line he chose to cross. 3 days after the funeral, the first letter came in the mail. It was thick, with my name printed in bold serif across the front, no return address. Inside were copies of the documents Jasper had served me at the grave site, along with a formal notice of his intention to pursue legal action. There was no note, no apology, just signatures and deadlines. I didn't cry, I didn't even flinch. Instead, I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table where Kenneth used to spread out seed catalogs, and reread everything line by line. I highlighted sections, I marked questions in the margins. Then I called Bruce and told him it had started. He came over that afternoon with a canvas briefcase, and a quiet kind of focus I hadn't seen in him in years. We spread the papers across the dining table next to the empty vase that had once held fresh wildflowers every week. Bruce was calm, he explained each clause, he mapped out scenarios. Jasper's lawyer was aggressive but sloppy. There were assumptions, mistakes, language too vague to hold. But we needed to act carefully. Bruce said court could get messy, and if this went public, it would be a stain on Kenneth's legacy. We worked through the night, reviewing everything Kenneth had signed, his will, his medical records, even the voice memo he recorded for the county office after his last hospitalization, confirming his intention to transfer full ownership to me. Bruce told me that kind of thing could make or break a case. The next morning, I took the journal entry from the night Jasper hit me and scanned it into a file. It wasn't for revenge. It wasn't even to use in court. But I wanted it documented. I wanted someone else to know the version of my son that only I had seen. The part that hurt, not just with hands but with absence, with choices. Later that week, I went into town for the first time since the funeral. I needed to clear my head, get supplies, restock the pantry. But as I walked down Main Street, I noticed something different. People looked at me longer, some nodded, others avoided eye contact altogether. At the hardware store, Margie Latimer pulled me aside by the bags of mulch. She asked if it was true, that Jasper had come back for the land, that he was suing me. I told her I couldn't speak on it. Her eyes softened. She pressed her hand over mine and said she was sorry. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she had always wondered why Jasper stopped coming around, that she remembered him as a sweet boy once, the kind who helped her fix a flat tire in the school parking lot without being asked. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I didn't know how to tell her that that boy was gone, or maybe that he had never really been who I thought he was, that maybe, deep down, I had poured more love into him than he ever knew what to do with. When I got home, the fields were golden in the low afternoon light. I stood at the edge of the orchard and looked out over everything Kenneth and I had built. Rows and rows of walnut trees, perfectly spaced, steady and quiet. I realized then that this fight wasn't about land, not really. It was about memory, about who gets to decide what this place meant, about whether the story of this family would be written by the one who stayed, or the one who left and came back only for what he thought he could take. And I knew something else too. I wasn't going to let Jasper rewrite it, not in court, not in whispers around town, not in silence. It was the letter from the probate clerk that finally shifted something inside me. I had known it was coming. Bruce had warned me we'd receive a formal notice of proceedings within a week. Still, when I held the envelope in my hand and saw the court date typed in block font, it felt different. More final, like a countdown had begun. I placed it beside the fruit bowl, untouched, and stared out the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the porch. I could see the edge of the south orchard, where Kenneth once tied red ribbons around the trees he wanted to watch for blight. They fluttered gently in the breeze. That small movement, quiet and constant, reminded me what still lived here. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. This ranch was more than soil and crops. It was my body's memory. Every scar on my hands, every ache in my spine. It had raised me just as much as I had raised it. And I knew then I wasn't just defending it from Jasper. I was reclaiming it for myself. The next morning, I called Sharon DeWitt. She used to work for me during harvest season back in the 80s before she moved to Sacramento and started her own small business, helping family farms file for nonprofit protections. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but when I said my name, she remembered me immediately. We talked for 2 hours. I told her everything. About Jasper, about Kenneth's will, about the lawsuit, and about the ache I felt knowing I couldn't trust my only child. She listened. Then she asked a question that stopped me cold. She asked if I had ever thought about preserving the land through a legacy trust. I hadn't. Not seriously. But as she explained how it worked, I felt something shift again. The trust would remove the ranch from private inheritance. It would protect it legally as a place for agricultural education, local internships, and historical preservation. I would still live here, still manage it as I pleased. But when I died, it wouldn't pass to anyone. Not Jasper, not anyone's lawyer. It would belong to the land itself. I asked her to send over everything. Paperwork, timelines, legal limitations. I wanted to know the risks, the benefits, the loopholes. I read until my eyes hurt. Then I read more. That weekend, I met with Bruce again. We sat in the barn office with stacks of legal documents spread across the old drafting table Kenneth used for mapping irrigation. Bruce was skeptical at first, but the more he read, the more he nodded. He said it was bold. He said it would spark noise. But he didn't say no. And I had already decided. If Jasper wanted a fight, he would get one. But not on his terms. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't play the role of bitter mother in a courtroom. I would simply remove the bait. If he wanted half of something, I'd make sure there was no half to claim. This was no longer about who was right. It was about who still stood for something worth preserving. I called Sharon the next morning and gave her my answer. I was ready. The paperwork for the land trust took 3 weeks. During that time, I kept everything quiet. I didn't mention a word to the neighbors. I didn't call Jasper. I didn't even tell the women at the Sunday service who usually asked how I was holding up. I kept my answers short, polite, practiced. But inside, I was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Sharon guided the process like she was leading a horse through a dark stable. Steady steps, clear instructions. Every form had a purpose. Every signature a weight. I mailed documents, scanned old property maps, reviewed zoning codes. Bruce double-checked each clause. By the end of the 3rd week, the land was officially transferred to the Whitaker Agricultural Trust, named after my mother-in-law Ruth, who taught me how to prune the walnut trees when Kenneth and I first married. From that moment forward, the ranch was no longer personal property. It could not be divided, could not be sold for profit. It belonged to a mission, to educate, to sustain, to honor the work of hands over generations. I stood at the edge of the east field after the final signatures were confirmed, and watched the fog roll low over the hills. For the first time in months, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The court date arrived on a Thursday. The building smelled like pine cleaner and old coffee. I wore a navy dress and my late mother's brooch, the one shaped like a gold maple leaf. Bruce carried our files in a thin leather folder. Sharon came with us, dressed in a beige coat and flat shoes that squeaked on the linoleum floors. Jasper was already there. His lawyer sat beside him, young and impatient. Jasper wore a dark suit, cleaner than the one from the funeral. His face was blank, not angry, not smug, just blank. Like this was a business meeting, and I was simply the opposing party. We didn't speak. Not a nod, not a glance. When the hearing began, the judge asked for opening remarks. Jasper's lawyer started first. He laid out claims of shared inheritance, pointed to birthright, emphasized emotional hardship and estrangement. He painted Jasper as a misunderstood son seeking fairness. Then Bruce stood. His voice didn't rise, he didn't argue. He simply handed the judge the land trust certificate, the notarized will, and the memo Kenneth had recorded. He explained that the property in question was no longer subject to private claim, that my husband had acted within full legal rights, that the land now served a greater purpose beyond any individual's ownership. The judge nodded, took notes, asked for documentation to be added to the record. No raised voices, no drama. Then it was over. Jasper looked at me for the first time since he had walked into the funeral. His face shifted, just slightly. His jaw clenched. There was something like confusion in his eyes. As if he had expected me to cry, to break, to give in. But I didn't. We left the courthouse in silence. Sharon hugged me once outside, then headed to her car. Bruce walked me to mine. His hand touched my shoulder gently, nothing more. No congratulations, no celebration. At home I boiled water for tea and watched the light change over the orchard. The lines of the trees were sharper now, clearer somehow. The air smelled like purpose. That night, I slept with the windows open. The wind moved through the house like it remembered it belonged here too. 2 weeks passed after the hearing. The air had turned colder, with mornings dipped in frost and the evenings drawing in earlier each day. The ranch fell into its quiet rhythm. No calls came. No more papers. Jasper didn't reach out, and I didn't expect him to, but silence has a way of echoing. One morning, just after I'd finished stacking firewood, I found an envelope tucked between the storm door and the frame. No stamp, no name. Inside was a letter. Jasper's handwriting, unmistakably his, slanted quick strokes like he had rushed through it. I sat down on the porch swing and read every line without pausing. It wasn't an apology, not really. He said he was shocked at what I'd done, that I had taken something from him that was supposed to be his by blood, that Kenneth would have wanted him to have a piece of it. Then came the part that struck the hardest. He said he had already taken out a loan in anticipation of winning the case, and now he was stuck, said I had left him nothing to fall back on, that I had burned the bridge between us for good. I folded the letter and placed it in my coat pocket. I didn't cry, not this time. Later that evening, I went up to the attic. I hadn't touched anything in there since Kenneth passed. The space smelled of cedar and dust. I dug through old boxes until I found a small metal tin where we used to keep Jasper's childhood drawings. Stick figures, farm animals, crooked tractors. I ran my fingers over each one, remembering the boy who once stayed up late to help Kenneth wash harvest bins, who used to chase barn cats through the fields like he belonged to this land. That boy was gone, and I couldn't chase him back. The next day I mailed a letter of my own, just 1 page. I told Jasper I had received his message. I told him I understood his anger, even if I didn't agree with it. I told him I had protected the land because it was the only thing left that hadn't been twisted by bitterness. I didn't ask for anything in return. I didn't offer anything either. The following week I met with Sharon again. We sat at the picnic table behind the equipment shed, watching 2 of her volunteers from the AG program lay out soil samples for the winter teaching project. Sharon smiled as she explained their progress. The trust was working, slowly, quietly but working. Students from the community college had started visiting on weekends. Local growers were signing up for workshops in January. She asked if I wanted to give a talk at the next seminar about walnut cultivation, about soil cycles, about anything I wished. I hesitated, then I nodded. The next few days were spent preparing. I pulled out Kenneth's old notes, rewrote some of mine, practiced in the mirror once or twice, though my voice always faded when I saw my own eyes looking back. The day of the seminar, I stood in front of 14 people seated on bales of hay in the barn. They listened. They took notes. They asked questions. And when I spoke, something inside me returned. Not strength, not pride. Just steadiness. Afterward, a young woman with dirt under her nails and a nervous smile came up and asked if she could help prune next season. I told her she could start sooner if she liked. There was plenty to learn before winter settled in. As I watched her walk back to the group, I thought about the future. Not in a grand way. Not with hope tied to someone else's choices. Just in the quiet knowledge that something good had taken root here again. And I intended to keep it growing. It was late November when the final shift came. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a knock at the door near dusk, when the light turned amber against the fields and the cold crept into the floorboards. I wiped my hands on a towel, thinking maybe it was one of the students returning something they borrowed. But when I opened the door, it was Jasper. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched like a boy about to be scolded. His eyes met mine for only a second, before drifting away toward the porch railing. I didn't say anything. I stepped aside and let him in. The house was warm from the oven. I had been baking cornbread for the weekend workshop. The smell wrapped around us as he stepped into the kitchen. He didn't comment on it. Just sat down at the table, same chair Kenneth always used. I stood by the sink, waiting. Jasper pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. Then he looked up and said he was dropping the appeal, said his lawyer had advised him there was no point, that the land was untouchable now, protected, sealed off. I nodded, keeping my hands still against the sink edge. He went on, saying things hadn't worked out for him, that the loan he took had caught up with him, that he had to sell his place in Phoenix and was couch hopping with a friend. He didn't sound bitter, just tired. I asked him why he came. He looked up then, said he wasn't sure. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. He paused, then admitted he didn't expect the trust. He thought I'd crumble after Kenneth died, that I'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. But I hadn't. That moment stretched long. He glanced around the kitchen, the chipped mug on the windowsill, the faded curtains, the stack of lesson folders near the back door. He asked if I had really turned the ranch into a nonprofit. I told him, yes. He asked if that meant he'd never see a cent from it. I said yes again. He was quiet for a while. Then he nodded. Slowly. Not angrily. Just accepting something he hadn't let himself believe before. Then to my surprise, he asked if he could help with something. Anything. Even just to sweep the barn floor. I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the versions of him I'd carried over the years. The child in the mud. The teenager who slammed doors. The man who struck me. And now, this version. Hollowed out. Returned, but not really home. Finally, I told him there was a row of tools that needed sharpening, and a stack of workshop chairs that needed sounding before winter cracked them apart. He nodded again, then stood and walked outside without another word. I watched from the kitchen window as he moved across the yard. His steps were slow, unsure, but they were his. That night, I sat by the fireplace, turning Jasper's letter over in my hand again. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether he would stay, whether this version of him would vanish like the others, but I also knew I wasn't doing this for him anymore. I had built something rooted, and now it would outlast the noise. Even if he came and went again, the land would remain. The trust would hold. And I, for the first time in years, would not be the one left waiting. Jasper started showing up in the mornings, not every day, not with any grand apology, just quietly, like someone testing if the door would stay open. The first time, he came with a bag of gloves and asked if the compost pile needed turning. The second time, he cleaned the shed gutters without being asked. I gave him small tasks. Work that didn't require talking. He never made a mess. Never touched the house. He kept to the outer buildings, the trees, the edge of things. And I let him. The volunteers noticed. I saw the looks they passed when Jasper walked into the barn during their afternoon debriefs. They kept their distance, unsure how to treat him. I didn't explain. I didn't offer them a story. I just kept the rhythm of the place going like I always had. By mid-December, Jasper had started to show more interest in the Trust's programs. One afternoon, I caught him reading a binder Sharon had left on the porch table, the one outlining the spring curriculum. He didn't say anything when he saw me. Just closed the binder gently, and asked if we still had that old soil pH tester from the 80s. We did. That evening, after the volunteers had gone, Jasper stayed behind and asked about Kenneth's last harvest. It was the first time he had said his father's name since the funeral. He asked how bad it had gotten, if he had suffered. I told him the truth, that it had been slow, that some days were worse than others, that Kenneth had wanted to die here on his land, not in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. I told him Kenneth had gotten his wish. Jasper stared at the floor for a long time before he nodded, then he stood and left. The next morning, a package arrived. It was addressed to me, but the return address was from a bookstore in New Mexico. Inside was a copy of a rare agricultural memoir Kenneth used to talk about, one he had never managed to find. Tucked inside the cover was a note, just a few lines. It said he had remembered. I kept the book on the windowsill by the kitchen. I didn't say thank you. I didn't bring it up. But I noticed he lingered a little longer each day, that his shoulders didn't curve inward so much anymore. A week later, I saw him walking with one of the younger volunteers through the north field. He was pointing at the irrigation lines, explaining something. His voice was low, but steady. When they passed by the tool shed, I heard her laugh. That night, I sat with my tea and listened to the wind move through the porch screens. There was no resolution, no big moment of forgiveness. But something quieter had taken root. I had protected the land, preserved the mission. I had not opened my arms, but I had left the door ajar. And Jasper, for the first time in years, was walking towards something instead of away from it. I didn't know what would come next. But the earth was resting, the trees were strong, the hands tending them were new and old all at once. That was enough for now. By the first week of January, the frost had settled deep into the soil. The ranch slowed to its winter pace. Most days were quiet, marked only by the sound of boots across gravel and the soft thud of feed bins closing. I spent mornings in the kitchen with black coffee and paperwork, and the afternoons checking fence lines with Bruce, or reviewing the next season's workshop schedule with Sharon. Jasper was still around, not every day, but often enough that his absence started to feel unusual. One afternoon, I walked out to the north edge where the younger trees were being trimmed back. Jasper was there with Nora, a high school volunteer who had taken to pruning with surprising skill. He was showing her the right angle for clean cuts, how to check for disease in the branch tips. They spoke softly, but the rhythm was clear. Instruction, response, correction, patience. I stood back for a while before making my way toward them. When Jasper saw me, he paused, nodded once, then stepped back and let Nora continue on her own. I didn't say anything, just looked over the trimmed rows and noted how precise the work had become. Later that day, I found a folder left on the porch table. It was from Sharon. Inside was a formal request to submit the ranch as a case study for a rural revitalization program. The board wanted to feature it in their spring report. They had seen the data, they saw what we had built, and they wanted others to learn from it. There was a photo attached. One of the volunteers had taken it without my knowing. It showed the barn during the fall harvest workshop. Tables lined with soil samples, people listening. Jasper was in the corner of the frame, carrying a crate of tools, his face turned halfway from the lens. I kept staring at the photo long after the sun had gone down. That night, I sat down and wrote a short piece about the ranch, about the trust, about what happens when something broken is repurposed instead of thrown away. I sent it to Sharon, and within days she forwarded the edited draft from the board. They had accepted it. It would be published in the spring. The following week, I gave Jasper a copy. He read it without speaking. His fingers stayed on the page even after his eyes had stopped. Then he set it down carefully, almost deliberately. He didn't comment. But he stayed for dinner that night, first time in years. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the future either. We just ate. The heater ticked in the background. The same radio station Kenneth used to play drifted softly from the kitchen. Jasper reached for seconds. I refilled his glass. The dogs dozed near the back door. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't closure. But it was something. Something steady. Something honest. I went to bed that night without the ache I'd grown used to carrying. It had softened somehow. Not gone. But quieter. And when I looked out the window before sleep, the stars felt closer than they had in years. By early spring the land began to stretch again. The trees wore pale green buds. The ground, still damp from winter, gave off that familiar scent of thawed earth. Life was beginning to hum beneath the surface. And so was I. The workshop season picked up again, more volunteers, more lessons. Sharon brought a film crew one weekend to document the progress of the educational program. They interviewed students, filmed soil tests, walked the rows in the orchard with steady hands and silent or, I stayed mostly out of frame. That wasn't what this was for. Jasper didn't disappear. He didn't move back in either. He stayed close in his own way, fixing what was broken, replacing what had worn thin. I never asked what came next for him. I didn't need to know. Some evenings he sat with the others by the barn, swapping stories over supper. His voice wasn't as guarded anymore. He laughed once. Not loudly, but enough. On the first day of May I planted new seeds in the southern plot. The sun was sharp, the breeze steady. I worked with my hands like Kenneth once taught me, like I had done alone for years. But this time, I wasn't alone. I stood back and looked over the land, the fences, the rows. It no longer felt like something I was keeping alive. It felt like something keeping me alive. I hadn't forgiven everything. Some wounds don't close the way we want. But they stop bleeding. This wasn't a neat ending, but it was the right one. The kind built on quiet, daily choices. The kind that grows even when no one is watching. And that, I had learned, was more than enough. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, lost, or had to let go of to protect yourself, you are not alone. These quiet moments of clarity, of reclaiming your peace, they matter more than we know. If you've found strength in silence, or rebuilt something with your own hands, share it in the comments. Sometimes, healing begins when we see ourselves in someone else's story.